Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of In Pit Lane here on Channel 31 Melbourne, Channel 44 Adelaide and of course the In Pit Lane YouTube channel. Well, this week on the program we're going to talk one of my favourite topics in motorsport, sports sedans. Sports sedans, if you go back many years, were the number one attraction in Australian circuit racing. Big names like John McCormick, Alan Moffat, Peter Brock, Bob Jane, David Robertson, Frank Gardner, you could go all sorts of people over the years. John Goss, they all race sports sedans. Well, tonight we're going to be joined by our special guest from Queensland. He is Phillip Crompton. Phil has been racing sports sedans and been involved in the running of the National Sports Sedan Series for a very long time now. We're going to reminisce a bit about the old days, but we're also going to look about what's happening today, and we're also going to have a bit of a chat about what's happening in the future with this exciting category. So if you love your sports sedans, your big bangers, your big V8 powered whatevers, then be joining us. Stay tuned and join us a little bit later on for that conversation. But look, right now, let's check out what's been happening around the world of motorsport. It's pretty much all been happening internationally, but let's find out what it was anyway with the In Pit Lane Motorsport News. Tyres, those round black rubber things, will be the main talking point at Silverstone this weekend for the one-off 70th anniversary Grand Prix. This comes after last week's chaotic end to the British Grand Prix at the same circuit as Lewis Hamilton just hung on to win despite a delaminated and flat front left-hand tyre. Max Verstappen, who had changed tyres late in the race, failed by a hair's breadth to catch and pass Hamilton, who dominated the race from the start. Hamilton's teammate Valtteri Bottas, who also lost a left-hand front tyre late in the race, had looked set to make it another Mercedes 1-2, but his tyre failure dropped him back to 11th place. This saw Charles Leclerc move into third place, a position Ferrari would not have expected at the start of the race. Australia's Daniel Ricciardo came from 8th position on the grid to finish 4th in his best result yet for Renault. This weekend's racing will see teams using even softer compound tyres, adding a new strategic wrinkle to the weekend's race, which will still almost certainly be won by Hamilton. The DTM returned to racing last weekend with the opening two races at Belgium's iconic Spa-Francorchamps circuit. But the series looks set to be the last as the manufacturers disagree over future plans for the championship. Audi, who announced that they were pulling out at the end of this year, have said that they would support privateer customer teams, but only if the series moves to GT3 regulation. BMW, however, say that they'll pull out of the series unless the series remains a fully professional, manufacturer-supported series. Either way, the era of the new Class 1 regulations, which are shared with Japan's Super GT series, looks like being a sadly very short one. Audi won both races on the weekend, with Nico Muller winning Saturday's first race in very hot conditions, while defending champion Rene Rast led Muller home in race 2. The COVID-19 chaos continues with the announcement that the Australian Production Car Championship round, scheduled for Sandown this month, has been cancelled. Not only that, but series boss Ian Sherrin says that due to the constantly evolving situation presented by COVID-19 and its resulting restrictions on travel, that all prospective calendar details originally issued on the 3rd of July should now be considered as under review. Meanwhile, one race series that is going ahead as planned is the popular Toyota Racing Series in New Zealand. The series has become a major showcase for young talent from all over the world, including Australia. But with the current crisis over this side of the Tasman, will Aussie drivers still be welcome across the Dutch?
We're working with the Ministry of Business and Immigration just to get exemptions for overseas drivers to come along in New Zealand for the series. So we're on the part of the moment. We don't have yet the outcome of it, but we're hopeful for in the coming weeks to have the outcome of it and just allowing those overseas drivers to come along and be able to race in the series for the 5 weeks.
With all of the chaos that's gone on, the cancellation of so many international junior formula series this year, do you think that might actually end up being sort of a benefit to you guys? That there may well be a few unspent budgets floating around in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world. Do you think that might pay off, that people, once you get up and running, that a lot more drivers might potentially say, well, we didn't spend the budget this year, let's head over there and do the TRS instead?
The amount of inquiries we get for the last 3, 4, 5 weeks from overseas drivers, it looks like is again another big interest for those drivers to come and compete, because basically they come across the border, they know they're going to have 5 weeks of racing in a safe environment. So that attracts a lot of drivers, despite to have potentially to quarantine for 12 days. They know that after the 12 days, they have 5 weeks of racing.
The 2021 Toyota Racing Series starts on January 22nd. And remember, if you'd like to get in touch with us here at In Pit Lane, you can email us at theshow@inpitlane.com. You can go to the website inpitlane.com. We have a YouTube channel, of course. Make sure you're watching us there, and please like and subscribe. Also, we're on Facebook, where every Thursday night at 9 o'clock you can see our brand new ZOOMcast, Full Course Yellow, and you can be a part of it. Just drop us an email and find out how. Also, we're on Twitter and Instagram. Lots of ways to keep in touch here on In Pit Lane. But we're going to take a break now. When we come back, we're going to be joined by our special guest, Phillip Crompton, and we're talking sports sedans. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Pit Lane. Well, let me take you back, boys and girls, to a time when dinosaurs ruled the earth, when there were monsters amongst us. Monsters like V8-powered Volkswagens and V8-powered Chargers and Toranas and Capris and Cortinas and Minis and Hillman Imps and God only knows what. That were, of course, the classic era of sports sedans. Sports sedans, for those of you who don't really know, sports sedans in the 1970s, right throughout that period of time, were probably the number one crowd puller in Australian motorsport. All the big names were there: Alan Moffat, Peter Brock, Bob Jane, Frank Gardner, Jim Richards. They were John McCormack. Everybody was there, and they would attract huge crowds. Well, sports sedans are, of course, still around. We see them regularly at the Victorian State Circuit Racing Championships, and of course a national series as well with the Shannon's Nationals for the past few years. One of the regular competitors and a man heavily involved in sports sedan racing over the past few years is our guest tonight. Joining us all the way from Queensland is Phillip Crompton. And Phillip, welcome to In Pit Lane.
Thanks for having me, Brad. It's always good to catch up with you.
Well, what are your memories of sports sedans? I mean, growing up, what are your first memories and cars or drivers that you remember from the past?
The first one that comes to mind is just up the road here a few minutes is Lakeside Raceway. I moved out here to be close to the raceway, and then they closed it soon after. But anyway, it's open again now. And the two cars that really impressed me when I went out, probably in my late teens, was the McCormack Charger and the lightweight Falcon hardtop that was John Goss's, or driven by John Goss. And they had a ding-dong battle at Lakeside that weekend. And I think that's probably the thing that really opened my eyes to sports sedans. And little did I know many years later that I'd be driving one.
Yes, it's funny, the things that go back. I remember I've told this story before, but the very first meeting I ever went to was the 1972 Tasman meeting at Sandown, and the vision in my memory is as clear as it was back in those days, and it was what they called then the improved production and sports sedan feature race, and the grid was Alan Moffat, Frank Gardner, Bob Jane, Peter Brock, Brian Thompson, Jim McEwen, Bob Gill was there in the ex-Gagan Mustang. And the thing was, as I say, all these years later, all of those people have been guests on the program over the years. I'd have never have thought at the age of 11 years old that, sitting in the grandstand going, one day I'm going to talk to all those people on a television show.
Yeah, it just happens, doesn't it? Some of the best things that's ever happened in my life are totally unplanned. And like another thing was I went to Surfers Paradise Raceway with a few friends one day, and we were watching racing, and the Holden Gemini series was sort of in the earlier days. They were reasonably modern cars back then, and it sort of spurred my friend and I to build one, and we raced that for 5 years. But we kept seeing these sports sedans all the time, and they were just too good to, something with heaps of power and made lots of noise and lurched all over the track. And I just had to have one of them. So I bought a Ford Capri and managed to muscle a 6-litre Ford V8 into it, and a 4-speed top loader and a 9-inch diff, and away we went. And we just kept breaking things for a few years, but eventually you learn.
I mean, that was the thing about sports sedans. It was basically the science of looking at a car and saying, how can I fit way too big an engine into way too small of a car and make it somehow handle. Though Peter Brock's philosophy that was his philosophy for the Austin A30 on his first interview on the show. That's what he said. He did some measurements and he went to the wreckers and he walked around and he measured a few engines and a few gearboxes and went, yeah, I can put that into that. And they're the sorts of things, I think that's the appeal of sports sedans for me anyway, is the fact that, it's probably the last bastion of the Australian special, but is it something that can survive in this modern day and age where people aren't going out and building their own cars nowadays? I mean, it used to be a project. You'd get together of a weekend and over the course of a year or two or even more years, you and your friends would get together and you would build something like that. Nowadays, much easier to sort of, pick up the phone, ring someone and say, can I have one of those TA2 cars for $180,000?
Look, I guess one of the reasons that drew me to it is you can cash flow into them. You don't have to go out and spend 100,000 or 200,000 in one hit. And I think my first sports sedan was $4,000, and then I managed to find some lovely relative of mine to shout me an engine, which I had to pay back in time. And the gearbox, I think they were readily available with the wreckers, so I bought one of those, and as was the rear end. And then a few mates and a few cartons of beer and a bit of cutting and welding and whatnot, and before you know it, you're on the track. I didn't know any better, I guess, in those days, and we just thought, oh well, we've got to make it work, so you go and make it work, don't you? And that's the best learning experience, I guess, you can get. Now, as for are people going to do it these days? Well, as it's turned out, my son's doing a great job of building his. It's not a V8 thing; it's a Nissan 2-litre turbo, but he's done a great job of suspension and ducting and electrical and engine management and all that sort of stuff. Adjustable bias brakes, all in what is relatively still a standard car, but it'll be fairly quick. And it's been a project, I guess, he's been working on and off for more than 5 years. So, yeah, there are still young people out there that want to exercise their engineering skills.
So tell us about the car that you're driving at the moment. It's a long, long way from that original Capri. I suppose in many cases you could say that it is very much the state of the art of sports sedans at the moment. Tell us about that car, the Mustang.
Well, it's my second Mustang. The first one I bought from a Trans Am competitor in New Zealand because I could buy a rolling chassis. Once again, I could cash flow into it. So I bought a rolling chassis, and I'd recently, at that time in 2003, had wrecked my Falcon sports sedan. So a lot of the running gear came out of the Falcon into the Mustang. As time went by, it developed a bit of a power down problem, which we found when we finally robbed it of bits and pieces. But it was also a heavy car. So we thought, let's make a nicer one. Let's make one that's about 100 kilos lighter so that we're down near minimum weight. And for a big car, it's not that far off minimum weight. And I ordered a heap of special high tensile steel and had a plan which was not that far removed from the original car, but it was stronger and torsionally rigid. And my son, being a draftsman, drew it up, and the company he worked at the time had the finite element analysis software, so the drawings went into that, and of course it was able to twist and turn and tell us where the chassis was weak. So that was all taken into account. So the car starts with the chassis, and it's a really strong, good chassis, extremely low centre of gravity, safe, probably one of the safest sports sedans on the track, and still light and aerodynamic. So and it's one of the few sports sedans that's relatively easy to work on. You can get at things. So that was what we had in mind when we designed it, make it as good to work on as possible, low centre of gravity, light, and there's a lot of good gear in that car that I've accumulated over the years.
Yes, it's all very well putting the engine alongside the driver somewhere, but when you actually have to work on the damn thing, it's nice when it's in a somewhat more conventional position in the car. Hey, look, we're going to take a break right now on In Pit Lane, but when we come back, we're going to talk about sports sedans, talk about a bit about the past. We'll talk about what's happening right now, and perhaps look into the future. This is In Pit Lane, Channel 31 Melbourne, Channel 44 Adelaide, and of course the In Pit Lane YouTube channel. Our guest tonight is Phillip Crompton. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Pit Lane. Our guest tonight, we're talking sports sedans with Phillip Crompton. And Phil, you talked about the Mustang that you're running at the moment. Of course, down here in Melbourne in particular, we're not seeing anything on the track at the moment, but I believe that things are sort of kicking off again up there in Queensland. You have a meeting coming up fairly soon, do you not?
We do, and that can all change, of course, but at the moment things looking pretty good. There's a few cases up here that I'm not sure if they've traced everything from them, but we're able to have a race meeting, and the Queensland Racing Drivers Association has a good race meeting every year. They call the Warwick 1000. It's held at Morgan Park track at Warwick, and the QRDA has always been very supportive of sports sedans, so I think we generally get 4 races, which I'm most grateful of at the moment, because a lot of guys in a lot of other states aren't able to do that. As a matter of fact, I was at a racetrack today with one of our customers doing a test day, and it's nice to still have that freedom.
Yes, it's certainly something that we're missing down here at the moment. Of course, that absolutely has thrown out the plans for the National Sports Sedan Series. You've been heavily involved with the National Series over the past few years. What's the state now of sports sedans? I mean, we've looked at them, obviously from a local point at the Victorian State Championship level, and it's been fairly consistent. Perhaps not the golden days it was a few years ago, but still fairly consistent, fairly good fields, fairly competitive. Where do you see sports sedans at the moment?
Well, I guess you mentioned about the history before, and of course Alan Moffat was the first sports sedan champion. He drove 2 cars that year, the Capri and the Chevy Monza. And when you look at it through history, and the 2 I mentioned before that I saw at Lakeside, there was always only really, I guess, a half a dozen cars in the field that were top level capable of winning. So there's never been a 30-car field where 30 cars could, possibly win. And it's not like some other classes, Porsche Cup or V8 supercars where all the cars are similar. I don't think it's in any worse shape than it's ever been in terms of the number of cars that are nationally competitive. I mean, of course, there's been some dominance. Tony Ricciardello's been very dominant since the moment he sat in his dad's Alpha, but there was always some dominance in some quarters. And you look back at Gagan and the Mustang, dominant. Frank Gardner and the Corvair, dominant. And you can go through, I guess there are other periods. Kerry Bailey, quite dominant when he was on top of his game. But there's probably more good cars out there now than there's ever been.
How difficult is it to get all those cars together? I mean, we often used to say, covering the Victorian State Championship back in the day when we used to cover that we'd look at the field there, and then you'd look at the field in the New South Wales Championship, and you'd look at the field up in Queensland and say, if only we could get the top 4 or 5 cars from each of these series together in one place at one time, we would have one hell of a race. But it was very hard. We went up with the Sports Sedan guys up to Wakefield Park, and we're hoping the New South Wales guys would sort of reciprocate the following year, and it just didn't happen. We said to them, and they went, no, we'll stay here. We're happy here.
It depends on whether they've got enough money to keep the car running. It depends if they can get the time off work, because I mean, I'm very fortunate. There's only one or two like me in Australia that basically I don't work. I race my car, and that's my life. So I go to the shed nearly every day and work on my race car or build an engine. You know, I do a bit of work for a couple of customers. It's probably, put it this way, it started off as a little bit here and a little bit there, but now it's getting a bit too much. But that means I can have like to go away and race in Melbourne. I'm away from home for a week. So, and if you do five rounds of a championship, you're probably going to be away for 4 of them. So there's 4 weeks. So that's, if you're working for someone, there's all of your annual leave just gone going to races. So, and then of course, you can't do it by yourself. You need a crew, and they've got to take time off and be there too. So it's never easy unless you're a professional team to cover this vast land of Australia. I mean, I was always in a fortunate position. I could do it, having my own business, which supported me, and but at the same time, I'm still the person that gets the car ready, builds the engines, built the car, polishes the car, changes the oil and the grease in both the car and the truck, puts it in the truck, drives the truck, and then races the car. I always try and get there a day early because I'm generally stuffed by the time I get there. But that's the sort of commitment you have to have. And not everyone's willing to do that either. And then you've got to, as John Goulet said to me once, who owns the Audi, which has been another iconic sports sedan, is you have to be an engineering genius to build one. And then you need a driver who's capable of driving it. Then it's going to take you about 5 years to develop it, and then you might have a good car. So, it's not an easy thing to do, but I can tell you it's very rewarding.
Well, there's certainly no doubt about it. I mean, when you get a good field of sports sedans coming out, there is still a buzz that goes around the crowd, however big that crowd is, whether it's at a state round or a national round. It'd be great to see them on some of the bigger categories again. I know for a fact, the sports sedan, the supercars were never particularly keen on when the sports sedans run. I remember in particular, Tony Cochran having a look at the lap times of Tony Ricciardello's car around Sandown and going, what the expletive deleted is going on.
Compliment, Brett, when the latest V8 supercar is pretty much a sports sedan.
You certainly now. I mean, yes, there's very little of the original DNA left, and possibly soon even less. Phil, thanks for joining us. It was good to catch up and chat about the sports sedans, and hopefully we'll get to see you and everybody else on the track very very soon. Good luck with what's coming up there in Queensland, and hopefully we'll see you back down here in Melbourne or out at the Bend or Mallala in Adelaide very soon. But for now, thanks for joining us in Pit Lane.
Thanks, bye.
Well, thank you to Phillip Crompton for that chatter. We could talk about sports sedans for ages, and in fact, after we stopped recording, we did. But for all of you watching at home, hopefully with the sports sedans, we'll be back on the track in Victoria and the rest of Australia very, very soon. Hey, that's all we've got time for this week. Remember, follow us on Facebook every Thursday night at 9:30. We have a thing called Full Course Yellow, where we just sort of get together. It's a bit of a sort of a general chat between myself and Doc and Peter and a few others on the program, and you as well. If you'd like to join us, you can do that. Just send us a message and say, hey, can I come? Can I play too? And, we'll probably say yes. Let's face it, we're pretty desperate at the moment for company. So we'll see you both here on 31 and 44 and the In Pit Lane YouTube channel next week. But right now, from all of us here at In Pit, well, all of us, there's me. From me, thanks for joining us in Pit Lane, and good night.